Beware the Ides of March. These words, spoken twice by a seer in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, forewarn of the assassination that toppled Rome's crumbling republic. The circumstances leading up to Julius Caesar's murder by a group of senatorial conspirators are some of the most widely reported days and moments in ancient sources. The fatal moment, so they say, was preceded by an abundance of omens, all of which Julius Caesar unwisely, or perhaps resolutely, ignored. With the March Ides approaching once more, we're taking a look at the supernatural signs that foretold the death of Julius Caesar, and with him, the remnants of Republican Rome. My name is Kate, and welcome to Hearth of Haemonia.
When these prodigies do so conjointly meet, let not men say, these are their reasons, they are natural. For I believe they are portentous things, unto the climate that they point upon.
Imagine reading a biography of John F. Kennedy that said that his death was foretold by unusual animal behavior, or a dream that Jackie Onassis had. Or that the Confederacy was doomed to lose the American Civil War because a child born in 1861 had a club foot. In general, the post-Enlightenment discipline of historical inquiry and historical writing tends to rely on epistemic evidence, scientifically sound proof. When we look back on the January 6th riot, which somehow happened over 2 years ago, we don't hear reports that Mike Pence's house lost power that morning, or that animals broke free from the Smithsonian Zoo, or any other weird occurrences like that. Instead, we hear about things like growing polarization, the weaponization of online spaces by hostile foreign powers, although not enough on that front, I'm afraid. In other words, the warning signs were here, on the physical plane. It's all evidence that leads up to a logical conclusion, rather than potential divine malice against the state, or divine favor of a man who's seeking more power. Now, this may be true for modern history, at least the official stuff, but primary sources from antiquity almost always include supernatural signs in addition to mundane evidence. In fact, the Greek contemporary historian Thucydides is famous because he didn't include anything that was too woo-woo. In fact, he doesn't even really talk about religion at all. Ancient Rome was a state that, on the whole, chose not to separate the natural from the supernatural. And when the government refuses to hold a vote unless birds are flying in a particular direction, it's not that surprising that we find supernatural details included in history and biography, genres that today we tend to view as strictly scientific and secular. Different writers, of course, go about it in different ways. For example, let's compare how two of Caesar's ancient biographers, Suetonius and Plutarch, talk about the omens leading up to Caesar's death. Suetonius describes the discovery of a bronze tablet in Capua, where colonists were moving a cemetery to a new location. They happened upon a tomb that was said to house the bones of Capys, Capua's founder. The plaque inside read, "Whenever the bones of Capys be uncovered, a descendant of that Iulus shall be killed by the hand of his kinsman, and soon after he shall be avenged by great disasters in Italy." Suetonius follows this up with a personal note. Just in case anyone thinks that the story is a made-up legend, its originator is Cornelius Balbus, one of Caesar's closest associates. It's clear that Suetonius trusts his source for this omen, and he doesn't question the validity of the story, unbelievable though it may be. Now compare that to Plutarch, who, as he often does, tries to cite as many sources as he possibly can. Rather than trying to create a cohesive storyline, Plutarch gives varying reports, sometimes even contradictory ones, in an effort to be thorough, more in line with what we would expect from a modern treatment of history. And it's not that he's trying to debunk anything or argue that the signs aren't there. In fact, he sort of non-committally agrees that it seems like one's fate isn't so much unexpected as it is inevitable, since they say that strange signs and apparitions manifested. And even if all of these omens could be explained away, he continues, it was clear that the divine had marked Caesar as a dead man, since his assassination took place at the foot of the statue of Pompey, his fallen rival. Even more skeptical writers who wanted to present themselves as objective took for granted the fact that the divine was always at work. In a society that has a state religion, where everybody believes pretty much the same thing, even otherwise objective reporting can include the ever-present work of heaven.
Oh, Caesar, these things are beyond all use. And I do fear them.
There isn't a good, all-encompassing definition for what sort of thing counts as an omen in antiquity. For those of you watching who are witches or magical practitioners, you've probably heard the common witchy wisdom that 1. Not everything is a sign, and 2. If you're looking for signs, you're probably going to find them. Suetonius says that the signs leading up to Caesar's assassination were evidentibus, obvious. So how did people in antiquity know which things to look at with suspicion and which things were natural, if unusual, occurrences? In general, omens are, as Calpurnia says, beyond all use. In other words, out of the ordinary. And while this is open to interpretation, there are some things that are reported that simply can't be read in any other way. Like when Plutarch says that, according to Strabo, men on fire were seen running through the streets, and that the servant of a soldier was hurling fire from his hand, but that when the fire subsided, no one was hurt. It's kind of hard to interpret that as a natural occurrence. So when Calpurnia complains of things beyond all use, she means really, really unusual stuff. There doesn't seem to be much of a distinction between things that show up spontaneously, dreams that need to be interpreted, and signs that are sought out intentionally in the form of divination. Whether a sign appears of its own volition in dreams or the waking world, or if it's prompted by a divinatory sacrifice, it all counts as evidence of things that are about to occur. In theory, if you see something that you think might be a sign, you could do divination to see if there's anything there. But as a matter of course, Romans tended to do divination on a regular basis, especially in the government. In that sense, an omen would always be present before a major political decision or event, either signaling that the gods were in favor of whatever action the state was about to take, or that they disapproved. Now, it's easy to spot omens in antiquity when they show up in quantity. What I mean by this is, much like witches and practitioners understand today, when things start to show up in groups or show up more often, it's a good idea to pay attention. Take a look at how Cassius Dio introduces omens leading up to Caesar's death. Furthermore, signs also appeared to him, not a few and not weak. The sheer number of omens signals that whatever's going to happen, it's going to be big. Each of the 4 major sources that I'm using for this video provide a list of omens leading up to the assassination. And while there's some overlap between sources, overall there are 16 unique signs that are given as omens of the assassination, and I'm being generous grouping some together that could be separated. Another way to spot omens is admittedly a little bit harder to grasp, and that is when something has an already known symbolic meaning, such as the unusual appearance of a nocturnal owl, usually associated with witches and witchcraft and danger in general, or some easily recognized characteristic about it that could relate it to the situation. To make up an example, if a one-legged man sees an animal with a missing leg that is, drinking from a sacred spring, the man could interpret that as good fortune for him because of the similarity. Suetonius tells us that a bird called the regaliolus flew into the Curia of Pompey on the day before the Ides of March. The regaliolus is probably a wren, but etymologically it's linked to kings, kingdom, kingship. In fact, J.C. Rolfe's translation, which I'll link below along with English translations of all of these sources, he translates regaliolus as king bird. Given how much discussion was going on at the time about whether Caesar is a king or wants to be a king, this random event feels, and I'm using this word deliberately, feels like it could be an omen related to Caesar's death, or at least something to do with him. The problem is that all of these things need to be interpreted, and individuals can interpret the same sign in different ways. Take an example from Caesar's army days when he was campaigning against Scipio and Juba in Africa. After ignoring the escape of his sacrificial animal, which is never a good sign to be honest, he tripped when disembarking from his ship. Suetonius says that instead of taking this as a bad sign, Caesar interpreted it positively, saying, "Teneo te, Africa," or "I've got you, Africa." The manipulation of omens was a regular practice among Roman politicians, since you could delay a vote on the strength of bird flight or how weird-looking a sheep's liver was.
They would not have you to stir forth today. Plucking the entrails of an offering forth, they could not find a heart within the beast.
By far the most common omen in the lists given by our sources is that whenever Caesar gave a sacrifice, the pros interpreted it to be unfavorable. Animal sacrifice for divination purposes was something that the Romans picked up from the Etruscans, a practice called haruspicy, where the inner organs, and especially the liver of an animal, would be read and interpreted. If a sign is read as unfavorable, it means that you probably shouldn't do whatever you're thinking of doing because you won't have divine favor on your side. This, along with interpreting the flight patterns of birds, which also shows up in our sources for Caesar, are the main methods of divination. There were standards and guidelines for what certain patterns in entrails mean, usually having to do with the general appearance of the organ, coloration, if there's any blemishes or spots on them. Different areas of organs like the liver corresponded to different deities or outcomes, and the presence of a blemish or a spot or discoloration either meant divine displeasure from the corresponding deity, or that whatever it is you're planning, don't. Most entrail reading was fairly straightforward, outside the realm of poetry. We all love Lucan's description of the bull that poured out black slime as soon as it was cut open and had this nasty tumor on its liver. But outside of poetry, most entrail reading is straightforward. So it's a big deal when Plutarch says that Caesar offered a sacrifice for haruspicy and they couldn't find a heart inside the animal. Now, it's impossible for an animal to live without a heart, and in Appian's version, which undoubtedly is drawing from Plutarch, he says that the interpreter told Caesar that this was an omen of death.
Cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once. Of all the wonders that I yet have heard, it seems to me most strange that men should fear, seeing that death, a necessary end, will come when it will come.
Shakespeare's version of the story follows the ancient sources in the sheer number of instances and people that tried to deter Caesar from going to the Senate meeting. Omens are seen or experienced by the conspirators, by Caesar's wife Calpurnia, by Caesar himself, and by several characters whose sole purpose in the sources, it seems, is to be there to warn Caesar of the danger that lies ahead. Plutarch and Suetonius both report a seer warning Caesar that the Ides of March, or the period leading up to it, would be full of unseen peril. Cassius Dio follows Plutarch's account pretty much exactly. Suetonius gives the seer a name, Spurina, which Shakespeare repeats. This character plays no other role in Caesar's biography in any source other than to warn him in this moment of the danger of the Ides of March. The same is true of Artemidorus, who shows up in Plutarch and Appian, and later Shakespeare. This character has somehow caught wind of the plot. Plutarch says that he was running in the same circles as Brutus, and he found out through the grapevine. Artemidorus writes Caesar a letter describing the plot and gives it to him as Caesar is walking towards the Senate house. Caesar puts it in a pile of letters that he's going to get to when he gets to them, but of course, he never does. That's just bad luck. But in the case of Spurina, pretty much everyone agrees that Caesar heard the message and chose to reject it, with some even reporting that he laughed at it. The one warning that Caesar heeds in any way is the urging of his wife Calpurnia, who has had dreams of Caesar's impending doom. Plutarch says that Caesar values his wife's opinion, and he never got the impression that she was someone who was overly superstitious. So when she's that worried, Caesar himself has a reason to be concerned. The combination of Calpurnia's warning, along with signs that Caesar has seen himself, are enough to make him hesitate. But they can't change his mind completely. In the end, he goes to the Senate house, and we all know what happens next. Some of the sources suggest that Caesar foreshadowed or even predicted his own death, and he may have even been eager to meet it. Plutarch tells us that right before the Ides, Caesar and a friend were discussing the nature of death over dinner and arguing what the most desirable form of death would be. Caesar says that the best form of death is one that is aprostoketos, or unexpected. Just a quick philological aside here, I don't think that aprostoketos can be translated as unforeseen in a divinatory sense. I wish it could. The verb dokeo, which is the root here, has more to do with thinking, expecting, maybe even anticipating. It can mean to seem, but it cannot mean to see. A and pros together mean not before, and so aprostoketos can probably best be translated as not anticipated beforehand. In other words, Caesar is talking about a death that is sudden or unexpected, rather than one that was missed by divination, or that lacks omens, or something like that. Suetonius reports that friends thought Caesar might be suicidal, perhaps because of failing health, or a desire to show himself in total devotion to the people, even at risk of his own life. He even dismissed his armed guards, who were always there to protect him. Was he overconfident? Did he simply put no stock in the supernatural, as Suetonius thinks? Or did he see himself as a hero, a martyr for the people, boldly facing the death which must come to us all?
When beggars die, there are no comets seen. The heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes.
Suetonius says that Caesar died in his 56th year, and he was recognized in the number of the gods not only by a formal vote, but also by common opinion. Since at the first games dedicated to his memory by his heir Augustus, a comet blazed for 7 consecutive days, rising at the 11th hour, and it was believed that Caesar's soul had been accepted into heaven. And it's for this reason that the image of a star is added to his crown. This comet, whose appearance is corroborated by Plutarch and by Pliny the Elder, oddly enough, was taken as the most clear and sure sign that Caesar had become a god through a process called Apotheosis. Caesar's heir Octavian, who would become Augustus, used the comet as part of his larger propaganda campaign in which he styled himself as the son of a god, Divi Filius, in artwork, literature, law, coinage, and anything that would broadcast his message to the wider world. Julius Caesar became the first god in Rome's newest religious movement, the imperial cult. His first act as a divine being was to deliver one last omen to Brutus, appearing as a ghost to warn him, "You'll see me at Philippi." Thanks so much for watching. If you liked this video, you can let me know by leaving a thumbs up down below. And if you're interested in Roman magic, religion, belief in general, and you want to see more videos on these topics, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Thanks again for watching. I truly appreciate it. Until next time.